How can a modern state lose the equivalent of a small city's population every single month and still claim momentum? By early 2025, one number began circulating quietly among military planners and security officials in the West. And once it surfaced, it changed how the war in Ukraine was discussed behind closed doors. The figure was not about territory gained or missiles fired. It was about deaths. Month after month, Russia's losses were being described in 5 digits, a scale more commonly associated with world wars than with a single contemporary conflict. This was not a rhetorical flourish or a political slogan. It was a cold accounting that reframed the entire war. At the start, the invasion had been sold as fast and decisive. The assumption was that pressure, shock, and speed would break resistance before costs mounted. Instead, the conflict hardened into something far more punishing. By its 3rd year, the defining feature was no longer maneuver, but consumption. Men, equipment, and time were being fed into a system that returned little except attrition. What made the situation unprecedented was not just the total number of casualties, but the pace. Losses were no longer measured by campaign or season, but by the calendar page. This rate matters because modern wars are not fought by infinite populations. Russia entered the conflict with structural demographic constraints, a shrinking workforce, an aging society, and limited pools of trained manpower. Every month of heavy losses therefore carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. Each name removed from a roster represented not only a soldier, but a worker, a taxpayer, and a future family member. When losses accumulate at scale, they begin to reshape national capacity itself. What startled analysts was how quickly the trend stabilized at a high level. In past conflicts, casualty spikes were often linked to major offensives or decisive battles. In Ukraine, the numbers stayed elevated even when front lines barely moved. That suggested a systemic problem rather than a temporary surge. Assaults continued, but gains were measured in meters rather than kilometers. The arithmetic of the war began to dominate its narrative. Progress on maps could no longer compensate for what was being lost in personnel. This shift altered strategic perceptions across Europe and North America. The question was no longer whether Russia could sustain operations in the short term, but how long it could endure a burn rate that exceeded historical precedents for post-World War II conflicts. Comparisons emerged naturally. Other brutal wars of the late 20th century had produced horrifying totals, but spread over many years and across multiple belligerents. Here, a single country appeared to be absorbing losses at a monthly rate that dwarfed those averages. The psychological impact of such figures should not be underestimated. Militaries plan around replacement cycles, training pipelines, and institutional memory. When losses outpace the ability to train and integrate replacements, quality declines even if numbers appear sufficient on paper. Experience drains away faster than it can be rebuilt. The war stops being about who has the better tactics and becomes about who can survive the math. For political leadership, this creates an uncomfortable dilemma. Admitting the scale of loss risks domestic backlash, but denying it does nothing to slow the trend. Public messaging leans on resilience and inevitability, yet privately, the numbers force recalculation. A war framed as existential leaves little room for retreat, even as the costs begin to outweigh any plausible gains. The result is a dangerous inertia where continuation feels safer than adjustment despite the mounting toll. By 2025, this single metric had begun to overshadow all others. Not drones, not tanks, not sanctions, but the monthly count of the dead. It became the quiet axis around which strategic conversations turned. Wars can continue amid destruction, but they rarely survive sustained arithmetic that works against them. The question now facing observers is whether this pace represents a temporary plateau, or whether it marks the point at which numbers themselves begin to decide the outcome regardless of rhetoric or resolve. Why did a campaign designed for speed mutate into one of the most grinding wars of the modern era? The answer lies in the collapse of early assumptions and the choices made when those assumptions failed. What began as an operation premised on shock and rapid political capitulation quickly encountered resistance that was deeper, more organized, and more adaptive than expected. Instead of recalibrating toward limitation, the conflict slid into an attrition model that prioritized pressure over preservation, with consequences that continue to compound. In the opening phase, Russian forces aimed to overwhelm through momentum. Airfields, highways, and command centers were targeted in hopes of disrupting coordination and morale. When that approach stalled, the fallback was not withdrawal, but escalation. The logic shifted from speed to persistence. If quick victory was unattainable, then constant pressure might achieve the same end over time. This transition was decisive because it locked both sides into a long war where endurance mattered more than finesse. The attrition model favored mass over maneuver. Instead of emphasizing flexibility and combined arms integration assaults, increasingly relied on repeated infantry pushes, supported by heavy artillery. Territory became a function of how much could be absorbed, rather than how cleverly it could be seized. This approach extracted a brutal price in manpower. Units were rotated and replenished rapidly, often with limited training, as the front demanded bodies more than expertise. What looked like resilience on the surface masked a growing erosion underneath. As the months passed, the pattern hardened. Gains were incremental, losses were constant, and operational innovation lagged behind the pace of destruction. The war turned into a contest of who could endure depletion longer. For Ukraine, defensive depth and adaptation offered a way to trade space for time. For Russia, the calculation was different. Leadership appeared willing to accept higher losses in exchange for maintaining offensive pressure, betting that numerical advantages and political control at home would offset the cost. This choice reflected deeper institutional habits. Russian military culture has historically placed less emphasis on non-commissioned officer autonomy and decentralized decision-making. In a fast-moving environment saturated with surveillance and precision fires, that rigidity became costly. When frontline units could not adapt quickly, they paid in casualties. The attrition strategy, rather than compensating for these weaknesses, magnified them by exposing inadequately prepared troops to increasingly lethal conditions. International dynamics reinforced the trap. Western support to Ukraine improved defensive effectiveness, raising the cost of each assault without necessarily enabling rapid counteroffensives. This asymmetry meant that Russia could continue attacking while suffering disproportionate losses. The war did not need to be lost decisively on the battlefield to become strategically untenable. It only needed to remain expensive enough for long enough. By 2024 and into 2025, the cumulative effect became impossible to ignore. Replacement flows struggled to match the pace of losses, not just in numbers, but in competence. Training cycles were shortened, standards adjusted, and experienced leaders pulled from quieter sectors to fill gaps. Each fix solved an immediate problem while worsening the long-term one. The army became larger on paper, but thinner in capability, a classic symptom of attrition warfare. This evolution from blitzkrieg fantasy to attrition trap reshaped the war's trajectory. Once entered, such a model is difficult to exit without political cost. Scaling back appears as weakness, yet pressing forward accelerates depletion. The strategic center of gravity shifts from battlefield breakthroughs to domestic tolerance and institutional endurance. In this context, the war's outcome becomes less about decisive moments and more about trends that unfold over years. The critical uncertainty now is whether leadership can recognize the limits of attrition before those limits are enforced by reality. History offers few examples of wars ended by persuasion when arithmetic was still running against one side. As the conflict grinds on, the question linking this phase to the next becomes unavoidable. How has the modern battlefield itself amplified these losses to levels that defy historical comparison? How did 21st century technology turn familiar battlefields into engines of mass death? The answer lies in the convergence of systems that reward detection over maneuver and punishment over protection. By 2025, the battlefield in Ukraine no longer resembles the environments that shaped military doctrine at the end of the Cold War. Instead, it has become a dense sensor and strike ecosystem where exposure is brief, survival windows are narrow, and mistakes are rarely forgiven. In such conditions, casualty rates escalate not because armies seek them, but because the environment enforces them. The most transformative factor has been the spread of persistent aerial surveillance. Cheap drones, once a novelty, now blanket front lines continuously. Small quadcopters scout trenches, track movements, and relay coordinates in near real time. Larger unmanned systems extend that reach deeper into rear areas. This constant observation collapses the traditional distinction between front and support zones. Any movement risks detection, and detection often triggers immediate fire. In earlier wars, concealment bought time. Here it buys minutes, sometimes seconds. Precision fires complete the loop. Artillery no longer relies solely on pre-planned barrages or human spotters. Digital targeting links drones, radars, and guns into fast kill chains. Once a unit is identified, strikes follow quickly and accurately. The density of munitions matters less than their timing. A single shell arriving at the right moment can cause more damage than dozens fired blindly. For attacking forces, this means that massing troops, a classic method of breakthrough, now concentrates risk rather than power. Mine warfare has returned with brutal effectiveness. Extensive minefields shape movement channel assaults and slow advances to a crawl. Clearing them under observation exposes engineers and infantry alike. When troops are funneled into predictable routes, defenders can pre-register fires and deploy loitering munitions to devastating effect. This combination transforms terrain into a weapon, one that multiplies casualties without requiring large numbers of defenders. Medical realities further skew the numbers. In conflicts where evacuation is rapid, wounded soldiers often survive. In this war, drones and artillery frequently deny access to casualties. The so-called golden hour shrinks when medics cannot reach the injured without drawing fire themselves. As a result, wounds that might have been survivable in earlier eras become fatal. This shifts the ratio of killed to wounded upward, making monthly death figures appear shockingly high, even when overall casualty counts include both. Adaptation occurs, but unevenly. Defensive forces benefit more quickly from these technologies because they can prepare positions, integrate sensors, and force attackers to reveal themselves. Offensives face a harsher learning curve. Each attempt teaches lessons, but at a cost measured in lives. When institutional flexibility is limited, those lessons arrive too slowly to offset the losses incurred while learning them. The human factor cannot be separated from the technical one. Soldiers operating under constant surveillance experience fatigue, stress, and reduced initiative. Movement becomes cautious to the point of paralysis, yet remaining static invites detection as well. This dilemma wears down units psychologically as well as physically. Over time, morale erodes not because of fear alone, but because survival appears arbitrary in an environment governed by machines and algorithms. By 2025, These dynamics have made sustained high casualties less an anomaly than a structural feature of the war. The battlefield itself enforces attrition, rewarding patience and defense, while punishing repeated assaults. Technology has not removed the human cost of war. It has redistributed it in ways that amplify losses for those unable to adapt quickly enough. This reality reframes responsibility. Casualty figures are not solely the result of strategic choices, but of how those choices interact with a transformed battle space. Persisting with methods designed for a different era produces predictable outcomes in this one. As losses mount, attention naturally turns to the institutions absorbing them. If technology accelerates depletion, what does that mean for the armies tasked with enduring it? And how does sustained attrition reshape command cohesion and competence over time? What happens to an army when loss becomes routine rather than exceptional? By 2025, the cumulative effect of sustained casualties has begun to reshape Russia's military from the inside out, altering not just its size but its character. Armies are not sustained by numbers alone. They rely on experience, cohesion, and leadership layers that take years to build and moments to destroy. In an attritional environment, it is these invisible assets that disappear first. The most damaging losses are not always the most visible. Junior officers and non-commissioned leaders form the connective tissue of any modern force. They translate intent into action, maintain discipline under fire, and adapt when plans break down. As casualties mount, these figures are lost at a rate that cannot be easily replaced. Promotions accelerate, standards relax, and command responsibilities fall on individuals with limited preparation. On paper, units remain intact. In reality, they become brittle. This degradation ripples outward. Training pipelines shorten to meet demand, compressing months of instruction into weeks. Specialized roles are filled by generalists and generalists by the newly mobilized. Institutional memory drains away as veterans rotate out through injury or death faster than they can mentor replacements. The result is an army that grows increasingly reactive, less capable of complex coordination, and more reliant on centralized control to compensate for declining initiative at lower levels. Command structures feel the strain acutely. As experienced leaders disappear, decision-making becomes more cautious and hierarchical. Orders grow more prescriptive, leaving less room for adaptation in fluid conditions. This rigidity interacts poorly with a battlefield defined by rapid information flow and precision fires. When frontline commanders lack autonomy, they are slower to respond to emerging threats, and delays translate directly into losses. Each failure reinforces the impulse toward tighter control, creating a feedback loop that further erodes effectiveness. Morale suffers in quieter ways. Soldiers entering units with high turnover sense impermanence. Bonds form quickly but break just as fast. Trust in leadership weakens when rotations are abrupt and replacements unfamiliar. Over time, survival becomes the primary objective, overshadowing mission accomplishment. This shift does not require defeat to take hold. It emerges naturally when units perceive that endurance, not success, is the measure of performance. Elite formations are not immune. Units once designated for rapid maneuver or specialized missions have been repurposed to fill gaps along static fronts. Their distinct training and esprit de corps dilute as they are absorbed into the attritional grind. This represents a strategic loss beyond casualty figures. Elite units function as reservoirs of competence and innovation. When they are expended in routine roles, the Army forfeits its capacity to regenerate quality. The long-term consequences extend beyond the battlefield. An institution accustomed to high loss rates normalizes them, adjusting expectations downward. planning assumptions shift from preserving force to replenishing it. Such a mindset may sustain operations temporarily, but it undermines the very qualities that differentiate a professional military from a mass levy. Over time, effectiveness declines even as manpower flows continue. By 2025, these trends suggest a force trapped in a paradox. It can still fight, still attack, still hold ground, but at increasing cost and diminishing return. Each month of attrition deepens the gap between appearance and reality. The army remains large yet hollowing, capable of destruction, yet less capable of decisive action. This erosion matters because wars are not decided solely by hardware or numbers. They are decided by institutions that can learn, adapt, and endure. When command competence and unit cohesion degrade faster than they can be rebuilt, the outcome becomes a matter of time rather than tactics. As this internal breakdown accelerates, attention naturally shifts beyond the military itself to the society that must sustain it. How long can a state absorb such losses before demographic and political pressures reshape the conflict at home? What happens to a country when the war's heaviest burden never leaves the battlefield but follows the dead home? By 2025, the consequences of sustained losses are no longer confined to military units or distant front lines. They are seeping into Russia's demographic structure, labor market, and political calculus, creating pressures that cannot be neutralized by censorship or rhetoric alone. Wars of attrition do not end at the trench. They end when societies can no longer carry their weight. Russia entered the conflict with demographic vulnerabilities that predated the first shot. Birth rates had been declining for years. Life expectancy gains were uneven, and regional disparities were already pronounced. Large-scale losses among working-age men intensify these trends. Each casualty represents not just a military absence, but a civilian one. Fewer skilled workers, fewer taxpayers, fewer families formed. Over time, this compounds into slower growth, higher dependency ratios, and a shrinking pool of human capital critical to economic resilience. The distribution of loss deepens the strain. Casualties are not evenly shared across society. Rural regions and economically weaker areas have borne a disproportionate share, accelerating depopulation and eroding local economies. These communities lose not only young men, but future stability. Schools shrink, businesses close, and public services thin out. Compensation payments may provide temporary relief, but they cannot replace long-term economic participation. In some areas, the war has become the dominant demographic event of a generation. Labor markets feel the impact quietly. Industries dependent on manual and technical skills face shortages that cannot be filled easily. Training new workers takes time, and the loss of experienced personnel slows productivity. At the same time, defense-related sectors expand, creating an imbalance between civilian and military-oriented employment. This skew distorts development priorities and ties economic health more closely to continued conflict, reducing incentives for de-escalation. Politically, the state manages these pressures through control and narrative. Public acknowledgement of loss remains limited, framed through abstraction rather than specificity. Names become numbers, and numbers become silence. This approach can suppress immediate backlash, but it does not erase grief. Families navigate bureaucratic processes to confirm deaths or secure benefits, often without closure. Over time, these individual experiences accumulate into a diffuse but persistent social weight. The risk is not sudden uprising, but gradual erosion of consent. Societies tolerate hardship when they believe it serves a clear purpose and has an end. Attritional wars blur both. When sacrifices appear open-ended and outcomes uncertain, patience thins. This does not require organized opposition. It manifests as disengagement, cynicism, and declining trust in institutions. Such shifts are difficult to measure, but they shape political stability in profound ways. History offers cautionary parallels. Prolonged conflicts that drain demographic and economic resources tend to weaken states from within, even when external fronts remain active. The lesson is not that collapse is inevitable, but that endurance has limits. Managing those limits requires adaptation and honesty qualities, strained by centralized control and rigid narratives. By 2025, Russia faces a narrowing set of options. Continuing the war at current cost deepens demographic and economic damage. Scaling back risks political vulnerability. Each path carries trade-offs that grow sharper with time. The demographic shadow cast by the war will outlast any ceasefire, shaping labor markets and social structures for decades. As these internal pressures mount, the conflict's implications extend beyond national borders. Allies and adversaries alike watch how societies absorb prolonged loss, drawing lessons for their own strategies. The question linking this domestic dimension to the global one is unavoidable. How do these internal strains alter Russia's position in a wider world defined by multiple overlapping conflicts and shifting balances of power? What does a war of numbers mean for a security order built on endurance rather than spectacle? By 2025, the implications of Russia's casualty trajectory extend well beyond Ukraine's borders, shaping how NATO, the United States, and their partners think about deterrence, escalation, and long-term competition. The lesson emerging from this conflict is not simply that losses are high, but that sustained asymmetric attrition can decide outcomes without dramatic breakthroughs or decisive battles. For NATO planners, the war has underscored a central reality of modern conflict. Resilience is cumulative. It is built from logistics, training pipelines, industrial capacity, and social cohesion, as much as from advanced weapons. Ukraine's ability to impose consistent costs has depended on layered defenses, adaptive tactics, and a steady flow of support that prioritizes sustainability over short-term theatrics. This approach has reframed success. Holding ground, denying momentum, and forcing the adversary to pay monthly have proven strategically potent, even when headlines focus elsewhere. Russia's experience offers a contrasting case study. Military power projected outward has collided with limits inward. High casualty rates strain force regeneration, erode leadership depth, and consume political capital. Each additional month at scale tightens constraints on what is possible next. For Western strategists, this dynamic validates a long-held assumption: wars between industrialized states are decided by systems, not slogans. The side that can replace losses learned faster and maintain domestic support gains an advantage that compounds over time. The broader 2025 security environment amplifies these lessons. In the Middle East, cycles of escalation reveal how militarization without political legitimacy magnifies instability. In East Asia, competition emphasizes deterrence through endurance rather than decisive confrontation. Across theaters, the common thread is capacity to absorb pressure without hollowing out. Ukraine has become a proving ground for this model, demonstrating how sustained defense paired with targeted innovation can neutralize numerical and material advantages. For the United States and Europe, the strategic implication is clear but demanding. Support must be predictable, sufficient, and calibrated for duration. Air defense artillery training and logistics are not glamorous, yet they are decisive. Interruptions invite risk. Consistency compounds pressure. At the same time, managing escalation requires restraint and communication, ensuring that pressure does not spill into uncontrolled confrontation. The balance is delicate, but the alternative, allowing attrition to normalize unchecked aggression, carries greater long-term costs. This war also reshapes how victory is defined. It is no longer about parades or lines on maps alone. It is about forcing choices. When an adversary's casualty curve dictates strategy, leaders must eventually reconcile objectives with capacity. That moment may arrive quietly through negotiations framed as prudence, or slowly through exhaustion that narrows options. Either way, arithmetic, not rhetoric, sets the boundaries. By 2025, the conflict illustrates a sobering truth. Modern wars can be lost long before they end. They are lost when institutions cannot regenerate, when societies tire of open-ended sacrifice, and when numbers refuse to bend to will. For NATO and the West, the challenge is to apply these lessons without complacency, recognizing that endurance must be cultivated deliberately. The question that remains is whether this understanding will translate into sustained commitment, or whether attention will drift before the math finishes